I won't take care of that old woman. Those 7 words changed everything. My daughter-in-law thought she had whispered them quietly enough that no one would hear. She was wrong. I heard every single word. And so did someone else standing only a few feet away. At that moment, I was staring at my son's casket, trying to understand how a mother was supposed to bury the child she had carried, raised, and loved for 45 years. The funeral home was filled with soft music, white flowers, and people dressed in black. Friends and relatives moved through the room speaking in hushed voices. Some hugged me. Others offered condolences. I appreciated their kindness, but nothing could soften the emptiness inside my chest. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 73 years old. 3 days earlier, I lost my only son, Michael. The grief felt unreal, like a nightmare I kept expecting to wake up from. Michael had always been the bright light in my life. After my husband passed away many years ago, it was Michael who called every evening just to make sure I was doing all right. He never forgot birthdays. He never missed holidays. He never let me feel alone. That was why hearing those words from Melissa hurt more than I can describe. She was standing near the front of the room speaking to one of her friends. Her voice was low, but the room had gone quiet enough for me to hear her clearly. I won't take care of that old woman, she said. Then she added something even colder. I have my own life to live. I felt the blood drain from my face. For a second, I wondered if grief was making me imagine things. But then I looked up and saw Jonathan Reed, our family attorney, standing near a floral arrangement across the room. His expression told me everything. He had heard it too. Our eyes met briefly. He said nothing. Neither did I. What was there to say? My son had not even been laid to rest yet. I turned my attention back to the casket and rested my hand on the polished wood. Memories flooded my mind. Michael learning to ride a bicycle. Michael graduating high school. Michael helping me carry groceries after my arthritis started bothering my hands. Every memory reminded me of the same thing. My son would never have spoken about me that way. The funeral service began a few minutes later. The pastor spoke kindly about Michael's generosity and character. Friends shared stories that made people smile through their tears. Throughout the service, Melissa sat in the front row wearing a black designer dress, accepting sympathy with practiced grace. To everyone else, she looked like a grieving widow. Only I knew what I had heard. Only Jonathan knew as well. As the service ended and guests slowly began filing toward the reception hall, I noticed Jonathan watching Melissa carefully. There was concern in his eyes. There was something else too. Determination. At the time, I did not understand why. But before that painful week was over, I would discover that my son had left behind far more than memories. He had left behind a plan. As guests slowly moved toward the reception hall, I remained seated for a few extra minutes, unable to leave the chapel where I had just said goodbye to my son. The room was nearly empty now. The flowers still filled the air with their sweet fragrance, and soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers in the ceiling. Everything looked peaceful. Yet inside me, nothing felt peaceful at all. I kept hearing Melissa's words over and over again. Each time they echoed in my mind, they seemed even colder than before. Eventually I stood and made my way toward the hallway. Family members stopped me along the way, offering kind smiles and gentle embraces. I thanked each of them, but my thoughts remained elsewhere. As I entered the reception area, I found myself staring at a large framed photograph of Michael placed beside a table covered with candles and flowers. The image had been taken only 2 years earlier. He was standing beside a lake during a family vacation, smiling into the camera exactly the way he always did. Confident. Warm. Kind. Looking at that photograph pulled me back through decades of memories. Michael had not always had an easy life. After his father passed away when he was only 14, we struggled financially for several years. I worked long hours at a local accounting office while raising him alone. There were evenings when I worried about paying bills. There were Christmas mornings when gifts were modest. Through all of it, Michael never complained. Instead, he became the kind of son every parent hopes to raise. When he graduated from college, he thanked me publicly during his speech. When he bought his first home, he insisted I keep a spare key. When my arthritis became more difficult a few years ago, he installed safety railings around my house himself. He never treated me like a burden. Never once. That was why Melissa's words felt so painful. They did not simply insult me. They insulted everything Michael believed in. While lost in those thoughts, I noticed someone approaching from across the room. It was Jonathan Reed. He carried a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a thoughtful expression on his face. He stopped beside me and looked at Michael's photograph. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally he said, "He was a good man." I nodded. "The best." Jonathan looked as though he wanted to say more. Instead, he simply handed me a business card. "Call me in a few days," he said quietly. "There are some matters Michael asked me to handle personally." The comment surprised me. Michael had never mentioned any legal arrangements. Before I could ask questions, Jonathan offered a polite nod and stepped away. I watched him disappear into the crowd. Something about his words stayed with me. Michael asked me to handle personally. The phrase felt important. Later that afternoon, as the reception continued around me, I noticed Melissa laughing softly with several friends near the refreshment table. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While I sat surrounded by memories of my son, she already seemed focused on whatever came next. And for the first time since the funeral began, I found myself wondering whether Michael had seen something before he died that I had completely missed. The days following the funeral passed in a haze of silence and routine. Each morning I woke up expecting to hear Michael's voice on the phone the way I had for years. Every evening I found myself glancing at the clock around 7 o'clock, the time he usually called to check on me. Grief has a strange way of making absence feel present. The house seemed larger than it ever had before. The quiet felt heavier. Yet amid that sadness, certain memories began resurfacing with unusual clarity. I found myself thinking about Melissa. There had been a time when I genuinely loved her like a daughter. When Michael first introduced us nearly 20 years earlier, she was charming, thoughtful, and attentive. She remembered birthdays. She brought homemade desserts to family dinners. She volunteered to help whenever someone needed assistance. I remember telling friends how fortunate Michael was to have found someone so caring. For years, I believed it completely. The changes happened slowly enough that I barely noticed them at first. After Michael received a promotion at work and their financial situation improved, Melissa seemed different. Family dinners became less frequent. Invitations became selective. Conversations that once included everyone gradually centered around her preferences. At first, I blamed stress. Then I blamed busy schedules. It was easier than considering the possibility that something deeper was changing. One Christmas about 5 years earlier, I arrived at their home carrying gifts for everyone. The living room was beautifully decorated. The dining table looked like something from a magazine. Yet throughout the evening, I felt strangely out of place. Melissa controlled every conversation. Whenever Michael and I began reminiscing about old family memories, she quickly redirected the topic. Whenever plans for future holidays came up, she decided them before anyone else could speak. Michael seemed to notice it too, but he rarely challenged her directly. He valued peace. Sometimes perhaps too much. Looking back, I realized that many of the small distances that developed between us had begun during those years. Not because Michael loved me less. Because he was constantly trying to balance two people he loved. One afternoon about 6 months before he passed away, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. We sat together on my back porch drinking iced tea while watching the neighborhood children ride bicycles down the street. He seemed distracted. Thoughtful. Several times he started to say something before changing his mind. Finally he asked a question that struck me as odd at the time. Mom, if anything ever happened to me, would you promise to speak up for yourself? I laughed softly and told him he was talking nonsense. He smiled, but it was not his usual smile. There was concern behind it. I mean it, he said. Do not let anyone make decisions for you. At the time I assumed he was worried about my health. Now I was not so sure. The more I remembered that conversation, the more Jonathan's words echoed in my mind. There are some matters Michael asked me to handle personally. Whatever Michael had seen before his death, he had clearly been thinking about it for a long time. And somewhere in those unanswered questions, I suspected the truth was waiting. 3 days after the funeral, I finally gathered enough strength to call Jonathan Reed. The number on his business card had been sitting on my kitchen counter ever since the service, quietly waiting for me to make the call. When he answered, his voice was calm and professional. After expressing his condolences once again, he asked if I could meet him the following morning at his office. There was something in his tone that immediately caught my attention. It was not urgency. It was certainty. As though he had been expecting this conversation all along. The next morning I drove across town beneath a gray sky filled with low clouds. The streets looked familiar, yet everything felt different without Michael in the world. Jonathan's office occupied the second floor of a historic brick building overlooking the town square. When I arrived, his assistant greeted me warmly and escorted me into a private conference room. Jonathan entered a few moments later carrying a thick folder. He sat across from me and folded his hands on top of the documents. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally he looked directly at me. Evelyn, there are some things Michael wanted you to know. Hearing my son's name made my chest tighten. Jonathan opened the folder and carefully removed several papers. About 8 months ago, Michael contacted me regarding updates to certain legal and financial matters. I frowned. Michael had never mentioned anything about legal planning. Jonathan seemed to understand my confusion. He was very private about it. He wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly before discussing it with anyone. As Jonathan spoke, pieces of old conversations began resurfacing in my memory. Michael asking unusual questions. Michael encouraging me to stand up for myself. Michael appearing concerned without explaining why. Suddenly those moments felt connected. Jonathan continued. Your son was particularly focused on your future well-being. The words immediately brought tears to my eyes. Even now, after everything, Michael had been thinking about me. Jonathan handed me a document containing notes from several meetings he had held with my son. Most of the information was technical, but one section stood out. In his own handwriting, Michael had written a simple sentence. My mother must always have choices. I stared at those words for several seconds. They sounded exactly like him. Thoughtful. Protective. Kind. Jonathan allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. There is more, but I cannot disclose everything until after a formal family meeting. I looked up. Why not? He leaned back slightly. Because Michael specifically instructed me to wait until certain conditions were met. My heart began beating faster. Clearly my son had anticipated something. Jonathan closed the folder and slid it back toward himself. For now, I only need you to remember one thing. Do not sign any documents. Do not agree to any major decisions. And if anyone pressures you, call me immediately. The seriousness of his warning surprised me. Yet before I could ask further questions, my phone vibrated inside my purse. The caller ID displayed Melissa's name. Jonathan noticed it instantly. Neither of us said a word. Slowly, I declined the call. A few seconds later, another message appeared on the screen. Melissa wanted to discuss future living arrangements. As I stared at those words, I suddenly realized that whatever Michael had been worried about was already beginning to happen. The drive home from Jonathan's office feels longer than usual. His warning echoes through my mind with every mile. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to any major decisions. The more I thought about it, the more unusual it seemed. Michael had always been careful and practical, but he was not someone who worried without reason. If he had gone to the trouble of making legal arrangements and leaving instructions through Jonathan, then something must have concerning him deeply. By the time I pulled into my driveway, another message from Melissa was waiting on my phone. This one sounded friendly on the surface. She suggested that we meet for lunch later that week to discuss what she called the next chapter. I stared at those words for several seconds. My son had been gone for less than a week. I was still struggling to get through a single day without breaking down. Yet Melissa already seemed focused on moving forward. That evening, I sat in my living room surrounded by old family photographs. One picture shows Michael at age 10 holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. Another showed him graduating from college. There was even a photo from his wedding day. Looking at those images reminded me of how much he valued family. He was not perfect. No one is. But he believes people should take care of one another. That belief had guided his entire life. The next afternoon, Melissa arrived unexpectedly. I heard her car pull into the driveway and watched from the window as she stepped out carrying a large designer handbag and a folder tucked beneath her arm. Something about the sight immediately made me uneasy. When I opened the door, she greeted me with a smile that felt rehearsed. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. "I thought I would stop by and check on you." I appreciated her and invited her inside. We sat at the kitchen table where Michael and I had shared millions of cups of coffee over the years. For a few minutes, the conversation remained polite. Then Melissa gently placed the folder on the table. "I know this is difficult," she said. "But sometimes practical matters cannot wait forever." My stomach tightened. She opened the folder and began to discuss future possibilities. Downsizing. Retirement communities. Selling larger properties before maintenance became overwhelming. Every suggestion was presented as concern. Every recommendation sounded reasonable. Yet something about the conversation felt wrong. I remember Michael's words from months earlier. "Do not let anyone make decisions for you." I remember Jonathan's warning. Most of all, I remember what I had heard at the funeral. Melissa continued speaking while sliding several brochures toward me. Beautiful buildings. Landscaped grounds. Comfortable apartments designed for seniors. Finally she paused and smiled. "You do not have to decide today, of course. I just thought it would be smart to start planning." I looked down at the brochures, then back at her. For the first time since Michael's funeral, I saw something clearly. Melissa was not asking what I wanted. She was preparing me for what she wanted. Calmly, I pushed the brochures back across the table. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "But I am not making any decisions right now." For a brief moment, her smile faded. It returned quickly, but not quickly enough. And in that tiny crack beneath her polished expression, I caught a glimpse of the impatience she had been trying so hard to hide. After Melissa left, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The brochures remained exactly where she had placed them. Bright photographs of smiling retires staring back at me from glossy pages. Comfortable apartments. Organized activities. Convenient living. On the surface, there was nothing wrong with any of it. Yet the timing told a different story. Michael had been gone less than a week, and already someone was planning where I should spend the rest of my life. That evening, I gathered the brochures and placed them in a drawer without looking at them again. The next morning brought another surprise. Melissa called shortly after breakfast. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost energetic. She asked if I had reviewed the information she left behind. When I told her I had not, a brief silence followed. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Then her pleasant tone returned. She suggested we continue the conversation soon because, as she put it, certain matters could become more complicated if delayed. After we ended the call, I found myself thinking about Jonathan's warning once again. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, I received a call from my granddaughter, Sophie. At 16 years old, she possessed the same honesty Michael had carried throughout his life. Her voice sounded startled when she asked if she could stop by after school. When she arrived, she looked nervous. We sat together on the back porch where Michael and I had shared so many conversations over the years. For several minutes, Sophie stared out at the yard before finally speaking. "Grandma, there is something I think you should know." My heart immediately tightened. Sophie explained that during the days leading up to the funeral, she had overheard several conversations between Melissa and a friend. At first, she had not paid much attention. Then she started hearing repeated comments about selling property, moving forward quickly, and making future plans. Sophie lowered her eyes. Mom kept saying that everything would be easier once certain decisions were finalized. I felt a chill move through me despite the warm afternoon air. Sophie looked guilty for telling me. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing." She nodded slowly. "Dad wouldn't have wanted you treated like a problem." Hearing those words nearly brought tears to my eyes. Michael's values lived on in his daughter. Before Sophie left, she handed me a small envelope. "Dad gave me this a few months ago," she said. "He told me to give it to you if anything ever felt wrong." My breath caught. The envelope had my name written across the front in Michael's handwriting. After Sophie left, I carried it inside and sat down in my favorite chair. For several moments, I simply stared at it. Michael had clearly been preparing for something. The question was why. Slowly, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The first line immediately made my heart race. "Mom, if you are reading this, then something has happened sooner than I hoped, and there are things you need to understand." My hands trembled as I continued reading Michael's letter. The familiar shape of his handwriting makes it feel as though he was sitting beside me once again. "Mom, if you are reading this, then I need you to trust yourself. There may come a time when people try to convince you that they know what is best for you. Listen respectfully, but make your own decisions. You have spent your entire life taking care of others. Do not let anyone treat you as though you cannot take care of yourself." I stopped reading for a moment and wiped away tears. Those words sounded exactly like Michael. He had always encouraged me to be stronger than I believed I could be. As I continued, the letter became even more surprising. Michael explained that over the previous year he had become increasingly concerned about certain conversations taking place around him. He did not accuse anyone directly. He did not mention names. Yet his meaning was impossible to miss. He wrote that some people seemed more interested in future plans than in present relationships. He wrote that he had heard discussions about assets, properties, and obligations that left him uneasy. Then I reached a sentence that made me sit upright in my chair. "If Jonathan asks you to attend a family meeting, please go. Everything will make sense there." I read the line twice. Then a third time. Suddenly Jonathan's behavior over the past week seemed far less mysterious. Michael had clearly coordinated something with him long before his passing. Near the end of the letter, Michael included one final message. "You are not a burden. You never have been. Everything I achieved in life was possible because of the sacrifices you made for me. Never forget that." By the time I finished reading, darkness had begun settling outside the windows. The house felt quiet again, but no longer empty. For the first time since the funeral, I feel as though Michael was still guiding me. The following morning, my phone rang shortly after breakfast. It was Jonathan. After exchanging greetings, he informed me that the family meeting had been scheduled for the following week. Several documents needed to be reviewed, and all interested parties would be presented. His wording was formal, but I could hear a sense of purpose beneath it. Before ending the call, he added something unexpected. "Evelyn, I recommend bringing Michael's letter with you." My grip tightened around the phone. "You know about it?" Jonathan paused briefly. "Your son planned carefully." That was all he said. Later that afternoon, another message arrived from Melissa. She wanted to know whether I had given any more thought to my future living arrangements. This time there was less warmth in her wording. Less patience. The message ended by saying that important decisions could not be postponed forever. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone down without replying. Then I looked across the room at Michael's framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf. The smile on his face seemed almost reassuring. Whatever was coming, he had anticipated it. And for the first time since I heard those whisper words at the funeral, I no longer feel alone. I felt prepared. The week leading up to the family meeting revealed more than I expected. Once I stopped ignoring the small details, patterns began appearing everywhere. Melissa called almost every day. Sometimes she frames her questions as concern. Other times she disguised them as practical discussions. Yet every conversation eventually returned to the same subjects. Property. Planning. Future arrangements. One afternoon she asked whether I had considered putting my house on the market. Another day she mentioned that managing a home alone could become exhausting for someone my age. Each comment sounds reasonable by itself. Together, they painted a very different picture. I listened politely and offered few answers. The less I said, the more Melissa seemed to reveal. 2 days before the meeting, she invited me to lunch at a restaurant Michael used to enjoy. I almost declined, but something told me I should go. When I arrived, Melissa was already seated at a table near the window. She greeted me warmly and immediately began discussing ordinary topics. The weather. Sophie's school activities. Community events. For a while, the conversation felt almost normal. Then a familiar shift occurred. "You know," she said while stirring her iced tea, "sometimes holding on to the past can make it harder to move forward." I looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "I just think people need to adapt when life changes." There was nothing openly offensive about her words. Yet I sensed the message beneath them. Adapt. Move forward. Let go. As the meal continued, she casually mentioned several future plans she was considering. Travel. Home renovations. Lifestyle changes. The way she spoke made it sound as though certain outcomes had already been decided. More than once, she referred to circumstances that had not actually happened yet. By the end of lunch, I understood something important. Melissa believed she knew exactly how the future would unfold. What she did not realize was that Michael had been preparing for that future too. That evening, Sophie called again. Her voice sounded brighter than it had since her father's passing. We talked for nearly an hour. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. "Dad always said that people show who they really are when they think nobody is watching." I smiled sadly. That sounded exactly like Michael. After the call ended, I walked through my house looking at photographs from different stages of our lives. In every picture, Michael seemed steady and dependable. The more I thought about his letter, the more confident I became that he had anticipated this moment long before anyone else. The morning of the family meeting arrived with clear skies and bright sunshine. I dressed carefully and placed Michael's letter inside my purse. As I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from Melissa. It was brief. She simply wrote that she hoped everyone could finally move forward after today. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone aside. Then I picked up my keys and headed for the door. Whatever was waiting at Jonathan's office, I had a feeling it was about to change everything. Jonathan's office was already busy when I arrived. Several cars filled the parking lot, and through the large front windows I could see family members gathering inside the conference room. As I walked toward the entrance, I felt a strange mixture of nervousness and calm. For the first time since Michael's death, I no longer felt completely lost. His letter rested safely inside my purse. Whatever happened today, I knew my son had tried to prepare me for it. When I entered the conference room, nearly everyone was already seated. Jonathan stood near the head of the table organizing several folders and legal documents. Melissa sat confidently on one side of the room wearing an elegant navy blue suit. She looked composed, organized, and completely at ease. In fact, she looked more comfortable than anyone else present. As relatives exchanged greetings and settled into their seats, I noticed Melissa speaking quietly with one of her friends. She seemed relaxed. Almost optimistic. It was the expression of someone who believed the future was already under control. Sophie arrived a few minutes later and took the seat beside me. She squeezed my hand gently before sitting down. Across the table, Melissa noticed the gesture but quickly looked away. A few moments later, Jonathan closed the conference room door. The sound immediately silenced the room. Conversation stopped. Chairs shifted. Every eye turned toward him. Jonathan thanks everyone for attending before explaining that Michael had left detailed instructions regarding various legal matters, financial arrangements, and personal requests. His voice remains professional and measured. Yet there was something else beneath it. A sense of purpose. As if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The first part of the meeting focuses on ordinary matters. Charitable donations. Personal belongings. Family keepsakes. Several items Michael had specifically designated for relatives and friends. People listened quietly and occasionally smiled when familiar memories were mentioned. Throughout it all, Melissa remains calm. She occasionally changes at her watch or exchanges brief looks with other family members. Nothing seemed to concern her. Then Jonathan opened a different folder. The atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the table before speaking. Before we proceed further, there are several instructions Michael directed me to present in a specific order. Melissa straightened slightly in her chair. Her attention sharpened. Jonathan removed a sealed document from the folder and carefully placed it on the table. The envelope looked older than the other paperwork. More important. More deliberate. Nobody spoke. Jonathan broke the seal and revealed the contents. Approximately 8 months ago, he began, Michael made substantial revisions to certain legal protections involving family assets and future decision-making authority. I noticed Melissa's expression shift for the first time. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Surprise. Jonathan continued reading. These revisions were made personally by Michael and reviewed on multiple occasions before final approval. The room grew even quieter. Sophie looked towards me. I could feel my heartbeat quickening. Across the table, Melissa no longer appeared relaxed. Whatever she expected to hear today, this clearly was not it. Jonathan turned the page and prepared to continue. Then he looked directly at everyone in the room and spoke a sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere. What I am about to reveal may surprise some of you, but Michael was very clear about his intentions. At that moment, I realized we had finally reached the beginning of the truth Michael wanted everyone to hear. Jonathan lowered his eyes to the document and began reading. His voice was calm, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. 8 months ago, Michael Parker established a protected family trust designed to preserve certain assets and ensure the long-term well-being of specific beneficiaries. Several relatives exchanged curious glances. Across the table, Melissa remained composed, although I noticed her attention sharpening with every word. Jonathan continued. The trust includes provisions that become effective immediately upon Michael's passing. The room grew silent. Even the faint sounds from outside the conference room seemed to disappear. Jonathan turned another page. Under the terms of this trust, Evelyn Parker shall retain exclusive authority regarding her residence, personal financial decisions, and living arrangements for the remainder of her life. I felt Sophie's hand tightened around mine. Jonathan continued reading. No family member, beneficiary, representative, or interested party may alter, transfer, sell, lease, or otherwise influence these decisions without Evelyn Parker's direct consent. A murmur spread through the room. Several relatives looked towards me in surprise. Others changed towards Melissa. For the first time since the meeting began, the confidence on her face weakened. Jonathan paused briefly before continuing. Michael further directed that any recommendations regarding Evelyn Parker's housing, financial planning, medical choices, or daily affairs shall be considered advisory only and carry no authority unless voluntarily accepted by Evelyn Parker herself. The significance of those words settled heavily across the room. Suddenly, every conversation I had endured during the previous week seemed different. Every brochure. Every suggestion. Every carefully phrased concern. Michael had anticipated all of it. Jonathan reached another section of the trust documents. Additionally, Michael established a separate financial fund dedicated exclusively to supporting Evelyn Parker's future needs and personal independence. This time the reaction was immediate. Several family members openly expressed surprise. One cousin shook his head in admiration. Sophie smiled through tears. Across the table, Melissa sat completely still. Jonathan continued. The fund shall remain under independent administration and may not be redirected, reassigned, borrowed against, or accessed by any other individual. Melissa finally speaks. I do not understand why all of this was necessary. Her voice remains controlled, but there was tension beneath it. Jonathan looked directly at her before responding. Michael explained his reasoning extensively during our meetings. That answer seemed to affect her more than the legal language itself. The room became quiet again. Jonathan carefully placed the trust documents on the table and removed another sealed envelope. Unlike the previous documents, this envelope carries Michael's personal signature across the seal. My heart immediately began beating faster. I recognized his handwriting. Jonathan held the envelope carefully before speaking. There is one final item Michael invited me to present after the trust provisions were disclosed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye remains fixed on the envelope. Even Melissa appeared unable to look away. Jonathan broke the seal and removed several handwritten pages. The moment felt different from everything that had come before. The legal documents protected me. I understand that now. But this was something else. Something personal. Something Michael had written knowing he might not be there to explain it himself. Jonathan unfolded the pages and changed down at the first line. Then he looked up at everyone gathered around the table. This is a personal letter from Michael to his family. As he prepared to begin reading, I suddenly realized the greatest revelation was still waiting to be heard. Jonathan unfolded the pages carefully and began reading. The room was completely silent. Even the air seemed still, like Michael's words filled the space. If you are hearing this letter, then I am no longer able to say these things myself. First, I want every person in this room to know how grateful I am for the role you played in my life. Family has always mattered to me. It always will. Jonathan paused briefly before continuing. There is one person I need to talk about first. Mom, everything good in my life began with you. After Dad died, you worked harder than anyone should have to. You sacrificed opportunities, comfort, and countless personal dreams so that I could have chances you never had. Every success I achieved belongs partly to you. Tears immediately filled my eyes. Across the table, several relatives lowered their heads. Sophie quietly wiped her cheeks. Jonathan continued reading. One thing has always troubled me. As people grow older, others sometimes begin treating them as though their opinions matter less. As though experience becomes a burden instead of a gift. I never wanted that to happen to my mother. The room remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. During the past year, I noted conversations that concerned me. Discussions about future arrangements. Assumptions about decisions that had not yet been made. Plans involving people whose consent had never been requested. Those conversations convinced me that additional protections were necessary. Melissa's expression tightened slightly. Jonathan continued. This letter is not about blame. It is about respect. Every adult deserves the right to choose how they live. Every parent deserves gratitude rather than obligation. And every family member deserves to be treated with dignity. The words seemed to settle over the room like a weight nobody could ignore. Then Jonathan reached the final pages. To Sophie. Never forget that kindness is strength. You have more of it than you realize. Take care of your grandmother when she needs company, not because anyone asks you to, but because love is a choice. Sophie lowered her eyes and smiled through tears. Then came the final section. To everyone else, remember this. The true measure of a family is not how they behave during celebrations. It is how they treat one another when life becomes difficult. Pay attention to those moments. They reveal everything. Jonathan stopped reading and looked down at the final paragraph. His voice softened slightly. Mom, if there ever comes a day when you feel alone, look around your home. Every room contains a memory we built together. Every memory contains my gratitude. You were never a burden. You were my foundation. And no matter what happens after I am gone, I hope you never forget how deeply you were loved. When Jonathan finished, nobody spoke. Several relatives cried out. Sophie reached for my hand. I could barely see through my tears. Across the table, Melissa stared silently at the documents. The confidence she had carried into the meeting was gone. In its place was something else. Discomfort. Reality. Understanding. After several moments, Jonathan carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. Then he folded his hands and looked around the room. There is one final matter Michael involved me to address before we concluded today's meeting. The room immediately grew quiet again. Whatever came next, I knew Michael had one more truth he wanted everyone to hear. Jonathan allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. The emotions in the room had changed. The legal documents had provided answers. Michael's letter had provided truth. Yet there was still one final matter remaining. Jonathan opened a smaller folder and removed a single sheet of paper. Michael invited me to conclude today's meeting with this statement. He briefly downgraded before continuing. He wanted there to be no confusion about his intentions regarding family relationships moving forward. Everyone listened carefully. Michael requested that all future family gathered in his memory remains open to every member of the family, including Evelyn Parker, and that no individual be excluded, pressured, isolated, or treated as an obligation. The simplicity of the statement somehow makes it even more powerful. Jonathan placed the paper on the table. That concludes his formal instructions. No dramatic confrontation followed. No arguments erupted. Instead, something much more meaningful happened. The truth settled into the room. People began seeing the past a few weeks differently. Conversations they had testified. Assumptions they had accepted. Small moments they had overlooked. One by one, relatives approached me. Some offered hugs. Others share memories of Michael. Several apologized for not checking on me more often after the funeral. Their kindness did not erase my grief, but it reminded me that Michael had been right. Family was not defined by one person's behavior. It was defined by the choices people made when it mattered most. Eventually, everyone began leaving. Sophie hugged me tightly and promised to visit that weekend. After she left, only a few people remained in the conference room. Melissa stood near the door gathering her belongings. For the first time since Michael's funeral, she seemed unsure. Gone was the confidence I had seen during the reception. Gone was the certainty that had shaped so many recent conversations. She slowly walked towards me and stopped a few feet away. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she quietly said, "I did not realize he felt that strongly." It was not an apology. But it was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from her in a very long time. I simply nodded. There was no victory in that moment. No satisfaction. Only understanding. Michael had not spent his final months trying to defeat anyone. He had spent them trying to protect the people he loved. Melissa lowered her eyes briefly before leaving the room. I never chased after her. I never argued. There was nothing left to prove. A few weeks later, life began finding a new rhythm. The grief remains, as grief always does. Some mornings were harder than others. Some evenings still felt unbearably quiet. Yet something inside me had changed. I no longer feel like a burden waiting for someone else's decision. I feel like myself again. One evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. A gentle breeze moved through the trees Michael had loved since childhood. Beside me sat a framed photograph of him smiling during a fishing trip many years ago. I looked at that familiar face and thought about everything he had done. Even after he was gone, he had found a way to protect my dignity. He had reminded everyone that growing older does not make a person less valuable. It makes their life story longer. As the last light disappeared beyond the horizon, I lifted my coffee cup toward the empty chair beside me and smiled. My son was gone. That pain will never fully disappear. But because of the love he left behind, neither would my strength.